About 4 years ago, I drove several miles off of a beaten track down an old bumpy dirt road, ruining my girlfriend's day. She gets carsick easily. I was attempting to make a video about some concrete pads out in the middle of nowhere. Concrete pads shaped like an arrow. She watched as I frustratingly grew a sunburn and attempted to make something interesting out of a trash script and piss poor planning. Alliteration aside, I'm back, this time at a different location, kind of in the middle of nowhere, at another concrete arrow. There are thousands of these, and almost all of them were built over a 20-year span from the 1920s until the 1940s, and their purpose was simple: guide the way. Though all that is left at a vast majority of the sites is concrete pads, they all follow a similar design, and for good reason. There is a center pad that serves as the base of an arrow. This center pad was the foundation for a beacon that literally lit the way. The arrow is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll explain it anyways. It points to the next beacon. The aft pad, so to speak, was another foundation for a shack, or a shed, the pompous rich cousin to the humble shack. This shack had not one, not three, but two generators that powered the light beacon. That's a lot of infrastructure, especially for the 1920s, when the interstate system didn't exist. Most roads weren't paved, and only half of Americans had electricity in their homes. And this was all done by the United States Postal Service. Well, not all, but it was started by the United States Postal Service. And it was built specifically for a 25-year-old technology, the aeroplane. Those crazy pioneer pilots, home from fighting the Red Baron and his flying circus over the European continent, were now looking for a job, and the USPS had an idea. Rather than barnstorming, selling airplane rides, and doing stunts for cash, why not deliver mail by aeroplane? Which Orville Wright literally said was infeasible due to the expense. But the USPS decided to ignore the literal inventor of powered flight, the first aviator, and started getting weird with this new technology. They were inspired by Earl Ovington, who in 1911 took a sack of mail on a 10-minute flight between towns in New York before dropping the sack from about 500 feet, resulting in said sack exploding. Along with being the first instance of a piece of mail exploding, it was also the first instance of an idea that would eventually lead to you being able to have aerial logistics deliver you a pair of lobster claw oven mitts off Amazon that I know you have in your drawer right now. Further inspiration came from Victor Carlstrom, who in 1916 was sponsored by the New York Times to deliver mail from Chicago to New York in a single day. Like Michelin creating eating guides to get people driving and thus using more tires, the New York Times was hoping to spread readership through the fledgling aerial delivery service. He didn't quite make it, having to turn around near Erie, Pennsylvania due to a confounded nut working itself loose in the fuel line. He showed up in New York the next morning, though. In 1918, the Postal Service made it official, establishing a route along the East Coast between Washington, D.C. and New York City. That would be the beginning of a nationwide network of airmail delivery. In fact, there's even a little plaque in West Potomac Park here in DC that commemorates the field that they used it for. I flew all the way out here to show you this. Please like and subscribe. I'm desperate. But now, if you were a corrupt congressman beholden by a big city slicker tycoon in New York City, you could send them a letter and they'd get it in around 3 hours. That's pretty crazy. But it's only crazy if you completely forget that telephones existed. But still, a handwritten thank you note for your quote-unquote donation is a lot more heartfelt than a phone call. Aviation and airmail grew rapidly in the decades that followed. Outside of these big East Coast cities, the airmail became really useful to get mail between, say, two arbitrary points, so long as you fell within about 40 miles of one of the designated routes. But still, if you wanted to get a letter from Egg Harbor, New Jersey to Von Ormy, Texas, and do it rapidly, in the early 20th century, you suddenly had a chance. So guys like Dean Smith, I mean, look at this guy. That's a mailman. That's a mailman. Guys like him took to the sky, the first of hundreds, maybe thousands of airmail pilots. The flying wasn't easy either. Long, arduous flights exposed to the elements, dealing with 1920s aviation technology, which was less than reliable on a good day. In fact, Dean Smith may have sent one of the most unintentionally hilarious telegrams during one of his flights between Omaha and Cheyenne. Sitting in a comfortable office in College Park, the division supervisor got the message,
"Dead sticked, flying low, only place to land on cow, killed cow, wrecked airplane, scared me."
And I can commiserate with Mr. Smith. Having flown helicopters for about a decade, at about the same altitudes and airspeeds he would have been doing about 90 years ago, we followed very similar flying styles. Paper maps, follow the roads, train lines, known landmarks, circle around a water tower with a town name on it. Real salt-of-the-earth aviators, me and old Dean Smith. I've had my fair share of emergencies, and I've had to land in the middle of essentially nowhere. In fact, in a similar instance, though not an emergency, I was doing night landings in a place I was very familiar with, and my co-pilot pointed out a boulder in the landing zone, which of course didn't make sense for a place dedicated for landing. The boulder then proceeded to get up and walk away, revealing itself to be a very annoyed buffalo. I didn't have to send a telegram back for that, fortunately. In fact, Victor Karlstrom, the poor chap with the confounded nut in the fuel line, died a year after his attempted flight from Chicago to New York. His airplane simply collapsed in flight, taking the 27-year-old and his student pilot with it. But that's how it went on in those early days of the airmail service. Pioneering is never safe. Take off at dawn, fly all day, land at night, drink half a bottle of scotch, and go to sleep. No flying at night, everyone knows that. That would be impossible. May as well tie one on after 12 hours in the sea. But the Postal Service wasn't satisfied with flying all day. The Postal Service wanted to fly all day and night. They wanted mail to go coast to coast in 2 days, and the only way to do that was for the mail to essentially never stop. And that is what brings me and you here again today, to the airmail arrows. During the day, life was easy. Point in a general direction until you see a geographic reference, a town, a known road or train line, and just follow that. Look at the map, look at the ground. Avoid clouds and cows. But as soon as the sun set, you had about 20 to 30 minutes max before you were SOL, as they might say. Not so much because planes fall out of the sky at night or are impossible to maintain altitude, airspeed, etc. There's instruments for that. But navigation became a nightmare. The night is dark and full of terrors. So a solution had to be created. And that solution, in 1924, was lighthouses. Except instead of telling someone where not to go, these lighthouses would tell aviators where to go, for safety, for fuel, for a place to land. These aerial beacons would first bridge the 1,600 miles of darkness between Chicago and Cheyenne, Wyoming. Here in Medicine Bows, kind of right outside Cheyenne, Wyoming, would have been an intermediary point. Baby beacons that automatically came on at night were set up every 3 miles. The main rotating beacons, which would be set up on the concrete pads and arrows like here, would be built every 25 miles, 10 to 15 miles in more rugged terrain. And in the first stretch between Chicago and Cheyenne, 5 giant 500 million candle power midnight suns would be built at the main developments, specifically Chicago, Iowa City, Omaha, North Platte, and Cheyenne. Emergency landing fields would be set up at the main cities and about every 30 to 50 miles along the way. So now you can put that bottle of shine away and get back in the saddle, fly through the night. Of course, this wouldn't all be done by a single pilot, but in stages, similar to the Pony Express, the short-lived horse-driven mail carrier service from decades earlier. Within just a few years, thousands of these beacons stretched across the continent, meaning mail could fly day and night by skilled aviators all across the country. Out here, those beacons and the generator shacks and concrete pads weren't built in the middle of cities and towns, though. Otherwise, they wouldn't be very useful. They were built to guide the way across the vast open expanses in the unlit, unmarked, barely navigable backcountry of the American West. Men had to haul the concrete, the machinery, the fuel, and everything else needed to build these structures up gravel hills, mountains, and hostile landscapes. And then they had to maintain them and keep them running. It's no small feat. In areas like this, horses and donkeys were used. Fuel had to be brought up to feed the generators. Brightly colored and apparently delicious lead paint would don the shack, tower, and arrow to stand out. The bulbs themselves were huge. The generators had automatic switches that would swap from one to the other if one failed, and could turn on due to extreme cold to stay operational. The beacons also had an automatic switch to swap between two bulbs located in the housing. This was a very advanced system, times 1,000, all maintained for decades to ensure these aerial delivery men would never go without a guiding light. Those early pilots lived through the literal Wild West days of aviation. Those soon came to an end in 1926 when the Air Commerce Act began codifying traffic rules, licensing, how airways operated, and publications that could and would enforce everything. Oddly enough, the beaconing system, controlled by the Airways division of this early form of the FAA, reported to the Bureau of Lighthouses, as they were essentially the same infrastructure. Aviation was quickly reducing the amount of time that information, objects, and people could interact with one another. In less than a century, crossing the country went from months on horse or in wagons to days on a train or car to 48 hours by plane. But like any other technology, one would undoubtedly grow to supplant the other. In this case, visual indications turned into auditory signals and radio frequencies. The low-frequency radio technology of the late 20s grew through the 1930s. 1929 saw the first instance of a pilot taking off, flying, and landing a plane using only instruments with no view outside the cockpit. This was conducted by none other than Jimmy Doolittle of the Doolittle Raid fame. Blind flying, as it was called, would revolutionize flying at night through clouds, smoke, and fog, and during weather. Post-World War II, with its massive boom in technological feats and discoveries, instrument flying became a standard practice, with radio beacons now guiding the way for not only government agencies, but the growing commercial space. The network of these visual beacons peaked just after World War II in 1946, but within 5 years, a majority would be in the process of decommission. A few stragglers remained until July 1972, when the last beacon was turned off, a short drive out of Palm Springs, California, almost 5 decades after their inception. Some were continuously maintained for other purposes until about 2017, but as of today, almost nothing remains of the system besides the concrete arrows that hide across America, once being the only thing that could be seen for miles around. So there you have it. If you enjoyed that story, check out this video. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching till the end. Now, get lost. I really hope one of the 470 people who ends up watching this video actually has a pair of those oven mitts in their drawer and gets creeped out by that statement.